Hello and welcome to A History of Role-Playing Games in 101 Objects with me, Mark Bowles. I'm the owner and proprietor of The Shop on the Borderlands, which is the UK's best selection of classic role-playing games. We also sell new stuff. There's the plug out of the way. What we're going to do in this series is take you through a history of role-playing games from essentially before the role-playing game began, right up to the current day. The current day, incidentally, right now is New Year's Day 2020. It's a whole new decade for role-playing games. And I think if we say that they started in the 1970s, that's the 1970s, 80s, 90s, noughties, 2010s, and now 2020s. That's 6 decades of role-playing games. So now seems as good a time as any to do a history of the role-playing game. This is by no means the first history of role-playing games, and if you look down below in the comments, I've listed some of the sources I've used for this talk. In particular, Playing at the World by John Peterson, which is an excellent book. Shannon Appelcline's astonishing work, Designers and Dragons, in 4 volumes, a 4-volume history of the role-playing game industry. And something that's been particularly influential, which we'll see later, is a documentary called Secret of Blackmoor, which you can get on Vimeo. Again, you can see the link down below. Well worth watching. There's more, and again, right down in the comments. Let's start though. This is chapter 1, Once Upon a Time. Now, chapter 1, we're going to go down to right back to the very early days. And I'm not going to start actually with object number 1. I'm going to start with object number -1, and it's this. This is a more recent copy, but what we have here is wargames rules for a war game called Strategos. Very old war games rules. This is a reprint. You can sort of see there. Strategos, a series of American games of war based upon military principles by Charles A. L. Totten, who was a first lieutenant in the 4th United States Artillery, and originally published in 1880. Now you're thinking, well, that's a war game rules. What's that got to do with a role-playing game? Well, there's a number of reasons why Strategos is relevant to our history of role-playing games. Number 1 was the sort of war games rules that Strategos was. Unlike some war games rules of the time or earlier, and you might include chess in this, Strategos was very much a simulation. It aimed to simulate a military battle, and it used random tables. It used tables and dice rolls to simulate this. So you can start to see there that this is an influence on what became role-playing games. How was that? Well, a copy of Strategos rules was found in a university library in Minnesota by a bunch of wargamers, a local wargaming club in Minnesota. And that forms our first of 2 important threads in the development of Dungeons and Dragons specifically. A thread in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities area of Minneapolis and St. Paul's, and there was a second thread in a small town in Wisconsin called Lake Geneva. We're going to start with the Minnesota thread though. And they started with Strategos, or they encountered Strategos, and they liked some of the aspects of it. They liked some of the simulationist aspects. And there's another thing that Strategos does, which most wargames rules at the time didn't. And that's it suggested that as well as having a player controlling one side, one army, and a player controlling the opposition army, you had a third player who was the referee. And the referee's job was to be a neutral, independent rules arbiter, but also to develop the scenario in the first place. Now, hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. The referee in Strategos, you can follow a thread there that starts with that and ends up as a Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master, and there is a very obvious continuation. Strategos, therefore, it's not a role-playing game by any means, but you can see that where role-playing games developed from war games, and they developed from this kind of war game. The third reason that Strategos is important, you have to think back to, this is the late 1960s, when we have our bunch of war gamers in Minnesota. So this is before the internet, this is before war game wargaming magazines are published in any large numbers. And so if you're a wargamer in the late 60s, it's difficult to find other wargamers. Somebody in Minnesota had the bright idea of thinking, well, this is a book in a library. You could check out this book in this library. Let's be honest, the only people likely to check out a book of 1880 Wargames rules from a university library in Minnesota are going to be wargamers. So somebody had the bright idea, let's get the names and addresses from the library and we'll write to all these people and we'll invite them. And actually they got quite a few gamers that way. To the point where this Wargaming Society in Minnesota, I think I've seen it suggested, was probably the biggest civilian wargaming society anywhere in the world. And we're not talking hundreds of people, we're talking dozens of people probably, but even so. The only other places you would find bigger wargaming societies than that would be military academies. Now, this is where we come to our first gentleman, our first pioneer. And you might be thinking, oh, is it Dave? Is it Dave Arneson? Is it Gary Gygax? Actually, no, it's a different name that you may not have heard before unless you're already up on the history of role-playing games. And it's a guy called David Weasley. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's spelled W-E-S-E-L-E-Y, I think. David Weasley. And Weasley was regarded as one of the best referees in the Minnesota wargaming group. People liked his scenarios. People liked he was a good independent arbiter, but particularly people liked his scenarios. So he was a very popular guy to run your game. Weasley, as we'll come to shortly, would go on to invent the role-playing game. Yes, you heard that right. I'm not saying that Gary Gygax invented the role-playing game or Dave Arneson invented the role-playing game. I'm going to make the case, not for the first time, that David Weasley invented the role-playing game. But we'll step aside for that. Just leave that in your mind for the moment. Let's step aside. Let's leave Minnesota. Let's go over to this other thread. Let's go over to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Small town. It's a sort of a holiday resort for people from places like Milwaukee and Chicago. It's on the side of a lake, Lake Geneva, as you'd imagine. And there's a bit of a gaming society there. And in particular, one of the people there is a guy called, you've heard of this guy, Gary Gygax. Gygax was a wargamer, somewhat short of money, had lost his job, was sort of doing odds and ends to make ends meet, like shoe repairs in his basement. But he was a pretty dedicated wargamer, and this brings us to object 0 on our list. Gygax, together with his friend Jeff Perrin, collaborated to produce a set of miniatures rules for medieval wargames called Chainmail. In itself, that's a little bit of an innovation because wargaming in the late 60s, early 70s is absolutely dominated by Napoleonic wargames, American Civil War, and World War II. That's most of wargamers are playing in those genres. There's not much Ancients, which is really big now. There's not much Medieval, which is particularly what Gygax and Perrin were trying to do. They wanted a set of medieval rules, and that's what Chainmail is. Now, Chainmail is interesting enough in that it is a set of wargame rules created by Gary Gygax. So in the history of role-playing games, given that Gary Gygax is such an important person to us, that's interesting itself. But the reason that it's object 0 for us in our list of 101 objects is towards the back of the book, Gygax wrote an appendix, which was how to use Chainmail to run fantasy battles. And this is pretty much the first fantasy wargame. He explicitly says this is fantasy battles in the to recreate kind of battles from books like The Lord of the Rings or Robert E. Howard's Conan books. And you can look at the Chainmail fantasy supplement, and it's got rules for dragons and orcs and so on it. It's a combat system. Arguably it's not actually that much of a mass battle system. It's probably sort of smaller scale skirmish to some extent. And this is very, very much useful if you want to run a fantasy combat. It's not a role-playing game. let's not get carried away and think that Chainmail Fantasy is the first role-playing game. It absolutely is not. It is for people commanding lots of miniatures on a table against somebody else controlling lots of miniatures on a table. It is a war game. It is a miniature-based war game, and it is essentially just an extension to this medieval combat game. Let's go back to Minnesota. I've introduced Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, but we need to go back to Minnesota now. We need to go back to David Weasley. Now, Weasley, as I said, was one of the most popular referees of the War Games Society in Minnesota. Unfortunately, his circumstances changed. He left Minnesota to go and do postgrad work at, I think, the University of Kansas. I think he's a physicist. And so he left, so a bit of a void filled. But he comes back Christmas holiday from university, and buzz goes around the society. Oh, Dave's going to run a game, and Dave's got this idea to run a game, rather different to the standard war game setup. It's going to be a multiplayer game for one thing, which they've done before. The Minnesota group have done many battles where there've been several different forces or different allies with one player controlling a particular ally, or 3 generals in the same army, that kind of thing, because they do Napoleonics. If you want to do, say, the Battle of Waterloo, then it's entirely natural that somebody plays Napoleon, somebody plays Blucher, somebody plays Wellington, etc., etc. So they've done multiplayer battles before, but this is going to be a bit different, because in this game, individual players are going to control individual characters. Now this brings us on to our object number 1, which I don't have with me. I've got a photograph of the same thing. This is actually a piece of plastic model railway terrain, which actually is, I found out when I was researching this, I found out it's actually still available to buy brand new. If you go to model railway shops and show them this photograph, you can probably get them to order you a copy. It's about this big, plastic scenery, and it's some Swiss castle or something, I think. In Weasley's scenario, this is Braunstein University. This sort of castle is Braunstein University. And Braunstein University is at the centre of a town which is under siege. It's a Napoleonic scenario. And individual players control individual characters, like the Mayor of Braunstein, or the student leader, or artillery captain, and so on. And there were about 20 players when they first played it. And the idea was that you would work out, as a player, you would work out what you were going to do, and you would write down your instructions, your orders. In fact, object number 2, credit here to John Peterson, because he owns this object. Object number 2 is an actual order slip that one of the players has written down. And Weasley sat in the next room. So the idea was, as a player, you would write down what your character was going to do on these pieces of paper, and you would go into the next room and give it to David, and he would work out what happens, come back to you, and the game would go on like that. And so Weasley didn't really finish the game. He felt, actually, sort of after several hours, this isn't really working. I've completely lost control of this. There's a point, for example, at which 2 players go up to him and say, our characters are fighting a duel, and he says, well, no, you can't do that because you're not actually next to each other. And they said, oh yeah, no, we did, we got together, we've arranged to meet you, but you didn't tell me. And what's happened is that the players in the main room are deciding what to do and interacting without telling the games master, if you like, without telling David Weasley in the small room. And that's not how Weasley thought the game would or should work, and so he felt that he'd lost control of it. The players absolutely loved this. They were having immense amounts of fun with this, to the extent that they begged him to do another one. And actually, a number of these Braunsteins get played. That's the name that comes to be given to this type of game, where everybody plays an individual character. I think there were a couple of Napoleonic ones. There's another one where it's a sort of banana republic Cold War struggle where players are CIA agents or communist infiltrators and so on. And incidentally, one of the same players who fought the duel in the original Braunstein plays a CIA agent in the Cold War one, and he has this brilliant idea that his objective in the game as a character is to distribute propaganda, and he captures a helicopter at the end and chucks all his propaganda leaflets out of the side of the helicopter, which is not something that anybody had thought. David Weasley had not thought that could happen, but because of the way the game is set up, it's freeform, and a clever player comes up with a clever solution. Now, I want to show you a picture of that clever player. It's this guy, and his name is Dave Arneson. You've possibly heard of him. If you haven't heard of him and you're a role player, then you damn well should have heard of him. And the fact that perhaps he's not as famous to mainstream audiences as Gary Gygax is, I think, it's a bit of a travesty. Because Dave Arneson, well, I'll come to Dave Arneson very shortly. Anyway, the point I'm going to make about Braunstein, about David Weasley's Braunstein idea is, it's a role-playing game. Individual people play individual single characters. They're largely freeform in the moves they can make. There is a games master controlling the event. This is a role-playing game. So there you go. This is my point. The role-playing game was invented by Dave Weasley. So, round of applause, please, for David Weasley. He still occasionally runs Braunsteins at conventions. If you're very lucky to go to some of the larger conventions in the US, you can maybe get GM'd by David Weasley in a Braunstein. And he's actually about the only person from our original Holy Trinity of role-playing game pioneers that's still alive. Anyway, David Arneson, this guy. Arneson, as we've seen, quite a clever player, and he's also, as well as Weasley, he was also regarded in Minnesota as a good games master, so as a good referee for wargaming. So Arneson decides, well, actually, I think I could run one of these Braunsteins. Only I don't want to do a Napoleonic one. I don't want to do a Cold War one. What I want to do is I want to do a fantasy one because I'm a bit of a Conan fan, etc. So yes, Dave Arneson runs essentially a fantasy Braunstein. And Object 1 again, what was Braunstein University becomes Castle Blackmoor. And the first ever fantasy role-playing game is this Braunstein campaign, run by Dave Arneson, in the dungeons beneath Castle Blackmoor. Yeah, dungeons. Here, in fact, Object 3, which we've got courtesy of Dave McGarry via a couple of routes. Dave McGarry, incidentally, was another one of these Minnesota gamers and the inventor of the Dungeon board game in his own right, an important figure in early fantasy gaming. But this map here, Object 3, this is what we think is the very first documented dungeon map, drawn by one of the players in Arneson's Blackmoor campaign. And Object 4 is a Wilderland, an outside map, a Wilderland map. This is from the book A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons. Sorry, that's from the video A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons, which again I do recommend. Link below. So that's our first fantasy role-playing game, isn't it? David Weasley's Braunstein was the first role-playing game. Arneson took that idea and put it in a fantasy setting, and Blackmoor was the first fantasy role-playing game, the first fantasy campaign. Now, we've mentioned Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and actually the Minnesota group and the Lake Geneva group are in contact with each other. Gary Gygax runs a small organisation called something like the International Federation of Wargamers, and they produce a newsletter called the Doomsday Book. So object number 5, here we have a copy of the Doomsday Book. This newsletter goes out to a very small number of people. And in fact, this is the envelope in which Gary Gygax hand-wrote the copy that he sent to Dave Arneson. Again, this is from John Peterson's private collection, so thank you, John Peterson. That was a lovely piece of history, that. So Gygax and Arneson were in contact with each other. And in fact, Arneson and a couple of the other Minnesota people, including, I think, Dave McGarry, went over to Wisconsin, and they ran essentially a Blackmoor campaign for Gary Gygax and his friends. One of those friends being Rob Kuntz, who we'll meet later. And Gygax thought this was brilliant. Thought, oh, this is fantastic. We decided he was going to do his own campaign. That became the Greyhawk campaign. And Arneson and Gygax hit it off, and they got together and they said, you know what we need to do? We should collaborate on a set of rules. And they did. And object number 6 is that rules collaboration between Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. And it was a set of naval wargaming rules for Napoleonic battles called Don't Give Up the Ship. You thought I was going to say Dungeons and Dragons, didn't you? Well, you're wrong. That's coming next. No, Gygax and Arneson's first published collaboration was Don't Give Up the Ship in International Wargaming magazine, a set of naval battle rules for Napoleonic era wargaming, Battle of Trafalgar, that kind of thing. Because actually, as well as both being into fantasy, Napoleonic naval battles was something that both of them had in common. And they both had collections of actual sort of little wooden ships for these. And in fact, one of the when Arneson wasn't running his fantasy Braunstein, he was running a sort of grand strategy Napoleonic Braunstein that involved naval battles as well. So they use these rules developed between them. They use that. That was object number 6, though. They start to collaborate, and Gygax is running his fantasy campaign, which he calls Greyhawk, and Arneson is running his fantasy campaign, which he calls Blackmoor. And these are long-running campaigns, whereas Weasley's Braunstein was essentially as a one-off, played in a day or weekend, I think. Gygax's Greyhawk and Arneson's Blackmoor are campaigns that run over a prolonged period, many sessions. Characters get stronger, and they win kingdoms and so on. And they decide actually that the two campaigns take place in the same world. Now, object number 7 that we have here is a rough hand-drawn map of that campaign world, and you can see the I think it's the county of Walworth, which incidentally, in real life, Lake Geneva is in the county of Walworth in Wisconsin, and you can see places like the Duchy of Ten marked on here, which Greyhawk scholars will the Duchy of Jeff, Greyhawk scholars will recognise that. Duchy of Ten comes into Blackmoor. So these are clearly, they exist in the same world, in the same universe, Blackmoor and Greyhawk, and it's natural therefore to collaborate. And it's decided that they will publish a set of rules for their fantasy campaigns. So Blackmoor and Greyhawk will have a set of rules. For a long time, there isn't a particular name for this. I think it's one of Gary Gygax's daughters who actually comes up with the name Dungeons and Dragons, but that's what we get. And so I'm going to quickly show Object 8, but then we're going to really talk about Object 8 and on in Chapter 2. But here is Object 8. That is what Dungeons and Dragons looked like originally. Now, most people tend to think of Dungeons and Dragons the earlier, if they've ever seen one, they'll have seen what we call a white box D&D set, because for the most part they came in a white box. As you can see, this is not a white box. The very early printings, the first 3 print runs or so of the game, came in what we call a wood grain box. You can sort of see that. In fact, you can sort of see the wood grain texture. It's a pretty naff box. Incidentally, if you've got one of these, it's worth a bit. I feel like almost should be wearing white cotton gloves for this. We'll open it up, a bit of an unboxing, but we'll do that in Chapter 2. Essentially, we've done Chapter 1. This was the very beginning. In Chapter 2, we'll look at the beginnings of Dungeons & Dragons and the first commercially published role-playing game. But hopefully in Chapter 1, you've seen how role-playing games grew out of wargaming, and you've seen how the two threads, the Lake Geneva thread and the Minnesota thread, came together to form the beginnings of Dungeons & Dragons. But I stand by my opinion that the role-playing game was invented by David Weasley. The fantasy role-playing game was invented by David Arneson. Dungeons & Dragons, well, we'll come to that next chapter. Link to the next chapter below. Hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.